when you're thinking about your journey and the journey that your team faced, what kind of challenges were you all looking at when it came to, formulating your strategy around lead and copper rule compliance?
Yeah, I think every public water system or water system in general, and every community obviously has its own characteristics, and they're all going to have their own challenges. So obviously we talk about age of community, size, what type of dwellings there are. For us in particular, a lot of what we have, most of our infrastructure obviously is underground, right? The last time we saw it may have been when it was installed, which goes back to the 50s and 60s in a lot of cases. And in the best case scenario, we would have documentation from that time period, which is not always the most reliable, even in its in the best state you can get it in. That's notwithstanding, the fact that these are old documents that can be lost to time. How has it's been preserved? So I think the biggest thing is accessing a lot of the old documentation about what was installed where, and in particular, trying to determine what materials specifically certain things are made of. The processes and the rules were different back when a lot of this stuff was installed. Now, not only finding the documentation, but also the methods that are required within the regulations, can be strenuous as well. Not for a good reason in a lot of cases. It's, again, we're trying to protect the public health and safety. So there is, you want to be sure about it, as sure as you can about a lot of these things, but it does come, it's a tall task in a lot of scenarios.
Thanks, Chris. Jamie, would love to bring you in on that. Is that a common thing you hear from our other Trin customers who are facing these challenges in terms of collecting documentation for lead and copper rule?
Absolutely. Every utility, as Chris mentioned, is a little bit different. Their makeup, where their data came from, the way they collected all that data is different. How they access it is different. So pulling that all together into an inventory is quite the lift. And, there was a little bit of a runway there, but there wasn't a lot. So pulling all that together was quite the chore. The other thing I'll say is that for all the years up until LCRR came out, the utility really only cared about the utility side of the property line. So the records around the private side of the service line are sparse, and that's a common theme I see across the utilities as well.
That's a great point that I'd maybe like to build on a little bit. For most of our operation, there's a philosophy of, working on what we are responsible for. And in a lot of ways, some of the new revisions, or some of the new rules are extend that responsibility further than they've ever been before. Because that responsibility doesn't reach back into the past, like Jamie said, the documentation, even the thinking about certain parts of the service line was clearly not as robust as it was for the side that we were always, definitely responsible for. And I think that's an underrated part of that, because I mentioned old documents and information that are subject to the methods of the time. Well, some of this wasn't anything that would be documented in some scenarios.
Chris, I'd love to get into a little bit around the moment when your team started thinking you might need a solution to help with these challenges that you're mentioning now. So could you describe that moment for me a little bit? What was the thinking leading up to that fact that you wanted to consider something to help?
Sure, there was a pretty specific moment. I am proud about how we kind of plugged away at this internally for a couple of years. We developed, in-house apps and processes for doing customer surveys and tracking, our own workflows and attaching, material observations to other workflows we were doing. And I was really proud about the work we were doing and the engagement we were getting with the community. And then there was a moment, because we were moving at a steady, but with, the amount of service lines we have and the lack of information that we had to begin with, a steady but slowish pace, right? There's just a lot of service lines to collect. So we were moving at a pace that worked for us. And then there were some new rules about mailing letters to all unknown service lines yearly. To unknown service lines, the idea being that they could, in theory, be made of lead or galvanized. And there were a lot of areas of town that we were, using our own knowledge, pretty confident, more than pretty confident, that there's no risk of there being lead. But because it's unknown, because the accepted verification methods are pretty specific and robust, these areas were still officially unknown. and looking at the number of unknown letters, letters to those residences that are of unknown material, just came with a cost that absolutely definitely outweighed whatever the cost of using a solution like Trinx would be. So that's actually the moment that we said we need a further solution to eliminate more of these unknowns, even though we were moving at a pace that I thought was pretty good.
Chris, so of course, the solution that your team ended up going with was the leadCAST tool from Trinx. I'm curious to hear from you what made leadCAST stand out amongst other solutions that you and your team might have considered.
Yeah, so in all honesty, at the time that we were shopping around, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of options. And the ones that there were, Trinx leaned pretty heavy into the predictive modeling angle, that service, which was, for the unknown letter reasons that we were talking about before. The predictive modeling portion was pretty important to us, was the main reason we were going this route. So it's just kind of mostly, it seemed like the focus of the company was aligned with our focus more, as opposed to I can imagine some other utilities just looking for a really good central app that's usable and user friendly, which Trinx comes with. But ours was really just because the focus on that modeling side of it was aligned with our focus.